Geyser has enjoyed the great pleasure of collaborating with Merrill Corporation over the last 5 years in the development of our thought leadership, and we credit them for the initiatives that we've undertaken through our symposium reports, our case studies, our surveys and analysis, and I'm going to guess that many of you are amongst the 500,000 plus readers that we enjoy in over 60 countries now of our best practices series. Every 60 days we bring a new installment forward to reflect the activities and the guidance of M&A professionals now around the world. And so I couldn't think of a better individual to lead the conversation. We've come to appreciate the breadth of Merrill's technology knowledge as well as their M&A knowledge. And so Richard Martin was a logical individual to tap to lead a conversation about a subject that I think you'll all be quite surprised about. It's certainly something that was not at the forefront of our thinking, but as I've learned more about it over the past couple of months, I think it is a subject that you should all be paying attention to if you are business owners, business investors, or advisors to business for sale. And with that, Richard, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. When David asked me to lead the panel, I had to do some research, and I thought I agree with him. In the spirit of our best practice collaboration, this makes a lot of sense, and I discovered that this is actually a very, very fascinating topic, so I hope you enjoy. We're talking about dealing with technology, cracking the value code, and obviously technology and software are fundamental drivers of business opportunity and success. Today, there are effectively a few different models by which a company can develop technology. There's property-based development, internal. There's an outsource-based, and then there's what we call a commons-based peer production model, which essentially speaking is open source software. The quote I'm going to give is from David Wheeler, the author of the definitive treatise on the subject. He puts it very succinctly. OSS are programs whose licenses give users the freedom to run the program for any purpose, to study and modify the program, and to redistribute the program copies of it in either the original form or a modified form without having to pay royalties to previous developers. So there's some advantages here. OSS harnesses the power of distributed peer review and transparency of process. The promise is better quality, higher reliability, more flexibility, lower cost, and an end to predatory vendor lock-ins. However, there are some risks inherent in it. It's important to note that proprietary, even contract development software, are not truly separate development methods. Today, as we'll see from our panel, open source software comprises anywhere, maybe 80% of code out there, and you may not even know it. So today, we plan to discuss this as a concept, what it is, why it's important, to make sure that as an organization consume more and more of it, it's managed safely. We've assembled a panel of experts who will share their insights and vast knowledge of the open source software space. And more importantly, we want to answer some vital questions. How is the use of open software changing organizations, and what is the impact on M&A? So we have an awesome panel. I'm not going to introduce them. I'll let them do it themselves. But Lou, why don't we start with you? You can give an introduction, and I'll join you.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. My name is Lou Shipley. I'm the CEO of Black Duck Software. Black Duck helps companies manage their growing use of open source. And so open source has become the sort of the fundamental building block of architecture for building software. And I just want to share one story about how I ran into open source. I'm a veteran of 7 Massachusetts technology companies, number private, number public. 10 years ago, I was CEO of a software company called Reflectant Software. And Citrix Systems came along and said, we want to buy your company. And we agreed to a price. And after we signed on the letter of intent, they said, now tell me, Lou, how much of your code is open source? And I was like, I have no idea. Like, I was the wrong person to ask this question as a CEO. So I went to our CTO and said, hey, how much of our code is open source? He said, tell them nothing. There's none. And Citrix was actually pretty buttoned down about this. Like, they knew the value of the intellectual property they had was going to be shipped under their name and their logo. And if our code had a lot of open source in it that was in violation of licenses that Citrix had as their corporate governance policy, I mean, it could query the whole deal. So I went back to Citrix and said, yeah, I don't think there's any. And they said, that's not a good enough answer. What you need to do is Black Duck your code. So I'm now CEO of Black Duck. At the time I found out about it, Black Duck scanned the code of Reflectant and then found that half of it this is 10 years ago, half of it was open source. So we had to go through a remediation process to make it compliant with the licenses that Citrix considered safe open source usage. But it was a real eye-opener to me that, A, as a CEO of a software company, I had no idea what was in my code or how much of it was open source, and B, how much value an acquirer like Citrix, which is a big software acquirer, how much value they placed in understanding what's in your code.
My name is Tony DeSico. I'm a partner at GTC Law Group. We focus on IP strategy and IP-centric transactions. I actually run the computer code audit and open source due diligence group at our firm. We represent many sort of Fortune 500 serial acquirers, private equity firms, VCs, investing in companies. And we also represent a lot of smaller startups and mid-sized companies sort of grooming themselves for acquisition. Actually, Citrix is one of our clients. And we kind of noticed in our practices over the years, I've been doing this probably 15 years now, we noticed the trend coming up that a lot of our clients had a gap in terms of this area, and they were interested in open source diligence that was causing problems on their deals. So we actually built this practice area to focus on this, because when you have a software or even a hardware deal, as we'll see, the software is the main asset you're buying, and if it turns out 80% of it is something that the company it doesn't actually own, that could make a big deal for your transaction.
Awesome, thanks, Tony. Phil?
Yeah, so I'm Phil Odense, colleague of Lou's. I run Black Duck On Demand, which is the part of Black Duck that conducts software audits, usually in the context of mergers and acquisitions, usually representing the buyer. I've been at Black Duck 8 years. I've been involved in some of our own M&A. And prior to that, right about the time when Lou was selling Reflectant, I was involved with selling a division of a technology company to another technology company, and ditto to Lou's story. I didn't know I was lying at the time when I said we're not using a lot of open source, and Black Duck came in and straightened me out, and so that was my first exposure. My first exposure to Black Duck was swearing at Black Duck. Bob.
My name is Bob Morse. Stratum Capital is a new private equity firm. We've done 8 deals in the software space over the last 2 years, just raised our first fund. We're solely focused on business IT. And so I'm kind of the customer up here, and I want to share a couple stories. I think one of the questions in the advisory world is like, is this like an interesting topic, or is this like something I should actually do something with in transaction processes? Either for a software company I sell, or if I'm going to deal with any other company that has a lot of IP and may write its own piece of software, whether that's for my security alarm company or my distribution company or somebody else. And I'd like to offer a perspective on it, because I think it does change outcomes in a meaningful number of transactions. And so it is a practical thing that you should take a decision about whether we actively do not want to do this, or not. You may not always decide you want to, but at least you should think again about whether it should be on the page of things that your firm does.
Awesome, thanks, Bob. So our discussion has been broken into 3 parts. We're going to talk about the background and state of play of OSS, get into some of the inherent risks, and then talk about the impact in M&A. So if we start with background and state of play, Lou and Phil, you want to give us some stats and fill in the blanks here.
Well, I think Lou's the stats man. I'll just sort of, I think you did a good job, Rich, setting the context. But just to elaborate on a little bit on open source and why it's worth paying attention to. Open source is software that's freely available on the internet. The open part refers to freely. The source is talking about the source code being available. And the implication of that is developers can have access to all this code, and Lou can give you some big numbers on that. But understand, the way software is built today is really about assembling pieces and stitching it together in clever ways and writing some proprietary code to put it together. But what developers are finding is that increasingly they can find those pieces free and available on the internet, and use that for the plumbing, the kind of non-value added part of their software, and focus limited resources on the secret sauce, the features your customers are asking for. So it's a very good thing. I've heard more than one venture capitalist say that they won't invest in a company that doesn't have a good strategy around using open source. But as we'll describe, eventually, there are risks associated that need to be managed.
Yeah, just a high level, just to give you context, there's about 1.5 million open source projects out in the world existent today, and that number grows by a couple 100,000 every year. and there's 2,500 different open source licenses you can publish your software under. So for a developer to go pick an open source project and figure this out, it's a big project to sort of manage and make some of these decisions. So it continues to grow, and it's really complex to manage the licenses.
And you had some stats, Lou, on what we're seeing in terms of composition of software. I mean,
yeah. So whereas in the past it might be 90% proprietary, 10% open source, we see, especially with the really big leading companies, tech companies like Google or Facebook, which are customers of ours, they're at 90% open source and sort of 10% proprietary. And we see that trend coming through in enterprises. So banks, insurance companies, and the government are now starting to follow that same trend that the leading tech companies like Google and Facebook are doing.
And we look at about 600 M&A transactions a year, and we're seeing on average, there's a range. It's sometimes 10% open source, sometimes it's more than 50. Average coming in at 35% of a code base is open source software, so very significant.
Tony, do you want to comment on some of the changes over time?
Kind of echo those trends. I've probably been involved in around 300 transactions in doing sort of the open source piece of it. We're very focused on this, and we've sort of seen this upward rise in the numbers. And it's kind of, there's two sort of related trends in terms of what this kind of increased use of open source is doing. Like one, we see the types of transactions that are impacted by it have increased over time. So it used to just be, traditional M&A would be impacted, but now we see sort of the investment rounds, whether it's the venture capitalists are sort of getting ahead of this when they're investing in companies because they know it's going to impact their exit event a few years down the road if they're not ahead of this. We have some PE clients now that are on top of this, for the same kind of reasons. They have to know what they're buying so they can plan ahead and make sure it's in good shape as they're going. One time I saw it as there was diligence on open source for like a loan collateral because the software was the main asset for the loan. And actually 2 IPOs I was involved with in the last couple of years, the Underwriters Council, so the bankers were focused on open source, and we got an open source questionnaire, and we were very surprised by that. So we've seen that trend as a result of the increased use of open source software, and we've also seen a trend sort of regarding, what is a software company? I call them inadvertent software companies. Software is everywhere now, so is open source. So we've seen a lot of deals that people would not think, were an open source deal or have open source issues, actually have them come to the front. So an example would be something like a, medical device company. There was a transaction where the company made, laboratory testing equipment. They shipped these machines that would sit on a lab bench and scientists would use it, but they were full of software and they were full of open source software. And then they sent all the data, through the internet to the cloud to get processed and spit back the reports. So they were just like a hidden software company that was sitting there. So you have to also think about the things you guys are doing. We looked at that slide with the sectors that are going to have increasing M&A activity. A lot of them, were not in the top right technology bucket, but they're full of technology. Like there are software companies, hiding there. Any hardware company is a software company, and they're going to be using open source software that's in there, and it can really deflate the value of the company if it's not addressed.
Thanks, Tony. And Lou, could you give a couple examples of the benefits? And Bob, also, I think you can give some war stories.
Can I give one?
Yeah.
I'll give a statistic. 100%. 100% of the time that we and the corporate development people that we know have asked people what open source are you using, and then used a code scan tool like Black Duck. We have found that they have things that they did not disclose that they might not have been aware of that they're using. Okay. Open source in general is a good thing, and you can build very valuable companies with it. Not knowing what you're using and not documenting it, creates problems. My other 100% statistic is Microsoft, HP, Cisco, CA, and I could go down a list of other leading tech companies will absolutely run this code scan course on your company before they buy it. I know one who runs corporate development for a very large software company who sets his LOI up such that our LOI gives us 45 days of exclusivity, and the exclusivity starts the day we receive the code scan results. Okay. So just if you're ever thinking about selling a business to a corporate acquirer, this will be an issue you face, and most people aren't aware of it. I loved Jaguars as a kid. I finally bought one right after college. I took it to the mechanic, and I said, "Does it leak oil?" And the guy said, "It's a Jaguar." I said, "Oh, sorry. How much oil does it leak?" He said, "Oh, not very much. It's in great shape." The question is not, do I have undocumented code in my source code? It's how much do I have? And that, I think, is the practical question that as an advisor in a transaction, you need to ask, would I like to know the answer to that before my buyer does, or not?
Thanks. And I think that leads us to the discussion of some risks. And I want to quote you from one of our conversations last week, where I think you mentioned that of open source code out there, 60% has security risks and 37% are severe risks. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So what happens, so the way the communities work is developers will develop code and then contribute it to an open source project. And then other developers can come and pick that and use it. Now the issue that can happen is, oh, by the way, the whole notion of this is that software not developed by a commercial company, say if you were to use Microsoft or Oracle, just their developers with their own code. Software developed in an open source community has more eyes on it and can be improved. And there's a lot of sort of developer pride in like solving a really tough problem and then having their other developers in the world recognize, hey, he solved this problem. So there's a sort of a competition for more and more open source projects. Now, one of the issues is that code can get embedded into a company that you're thinking of buying, and then after that time, there can be an open source security vulnerability found in that code. And there's about 6,000 known open source security vulnerabilities, about 11 new vulnerabilities found every day. If remember I said there's 1.5 million projects, that's growing. So you can have code that can pass the scan, but then the vulnerability can be found after the fact. So it's really important that you scan not just for the intellectual property issues, but to make sure you don't have a quote-unquote sleeper cell in your code that can then be exploited and getting hacked. And so understanding the vulnerabilities you have and having a way to remediate those is really, really critical.
And Phil, can you expand on some of the risks you see? And
Sure. I mean, I think the fundamental risk, we may have alluded to it but not been explicit, is that it's really hard for a company to know what's in their code. The availability means any developer can get anything they want anytime they want. Understanding what the developer's doing is difficult, and so that's why Bob's experience is 100% of the time companies don't know. Why Lou's in my experience is we were, said we thought we weren't using any. So that's sort of the fundamental issue. Lou talked about the security and some operational risk. Legal risk is probably the one that most companies focus on in the context of transactions, and Tony could talk for days on the subject, but essentially it is very possible to use some open source. It's all associated with a license, and it's very possible to use it in ways that do not respect the obligations that come with a license, and there's some particularly problematic licenses. And so companies are, the reason that the big companies that Bob alluded to are doing these scans is primarily to avoid a time bomb around a lawsuit or potentially losing proprietary intellectual property. There's a story that goes back about the time Lou and I were getting exposed to Black Duck, of Cisco buying a company and essentially having to release all of the paying $500 million and later having to release all of the proprietary intellectual property of their purchase because of a violation of an open source license. So that's sort of the big scary risk that companies are trying to avoid.
thanks. And Tony, maybe we can make some of this real. Can you talk a little bit about recent enforcement trends?
Sure, yeah.
And I mean, we mentioned copyright trolls.
Yeah, I was going to say there's been some significant developments in the last 3 years. So if you went back like 7 years or 10 years ago, like this conversation wouldn't be that important because the risk wasn't sort of real. It was very theoretical. The typical people trying to enforce rights under open source licenses were kind of professor types. They wanted you to appoint a chief open source officer, make a donation to their foundation, and they wanted to just kind of be righteous and show that they were sort of doing the right thing. But if you go back sort of 3 years ago, there's been some cases recently that are kind of business-to-business litigation. There are companies out there that have a dual license model, open source and commercial license. There's a recent case, Zimpleware versus Versata. It was for a GPL violation, and it was $150 million base damages was the claim on just the copyright side of the case. There was also patents implicated. There was also Continuent versus Tekelec. There wasn't an actual damages figure alleged, but it was a big deal. And both of these cases are interesting because there was an M&A transaction that sat on top of them. Trilogy Group had bought Versata in the Versata case, and so they had basically purchased this lawsuit. And it was interesting too, because if you look at all the pleadings, 2 weeks after the lawsuit was launched, the developers released a patch and they fixed the code. So had they done the diligence, ahead of time, they could have patched this thing and fixed it with like 2 weeks of effort instead of having, bad press, this lawsuit going on. It dragged on for, I think, 2.5 years. I don't know what the settlement amount was, but it was obviously something to make Zipware go away. Then also interesting was the Techelec case. So Oracle bought Techelec. I do Oracle's M&A work, so I represented them on that deal. I can say, they probably had a game plan to deal with that, so it wasn't like an unexpected thing that happened to them. So it's sort of, two different sort of stories on how this stuff can play out. And then something else we're seeing very recently, and I was predicting this years ago, so we all know about patent trolls, these people that come and try to shake you down for, scanning documents and emailing them, because they have a patent on that, apparently. The copyright trolls have started now, too. There's a lot of enforcement going on in Germany right now. There's this fellow, Patrick McHardy, who contributed some code to the Linux kernel. So Linux is a very, widely used open source project. It's an operating system on many things, including your cars. So he has been suing companies for GPL violations in a troll mode. He goes in, he wants 10,000 euros. You kind of settle that, then he comes back and says, oh, there's this other violation, I need another 10,000 euros. And he just keeps going and going and going. And he's done this to about 50 companies so far. And in Germany, the court system isn't as public as here, so no one can get together and sort of, beat this guy. There's a lawyer in the Valley right now, David Fligor, who's got an ad up basically looking for developers who thinks their rights have been infringed, because he's trying to come up with a class action lawsuit around open source violations. And there's another fellow, Harold Welte in Germany as well. He used to run opensourceviolations.org, which was kind of the old mode I mentioned of the professor type, just trying to get things right. He actually made a company now that's got investment, and they're looking for open source claims so they can start bringing lawsuits. So it's a very different world out there in the last 5 years, especially the last 3 years. There's been a lot of enforcement activity, so it's made this risk a lot more tangible, and it has dollars attached to it now, as opposed to just more abstract violations of reps that sort of don't come to roost.
We're actually just trying to scare off all new investment in the software. I think when we have found this, remediation tends to be in the weeks, and it tends to be easy to do and not that expensive. The code scan process is less than a week-long process. And so sort of my practical, just one other example, which is these things tend to go together. The company where we run the code scan and they don't know what's in it also tend to have had a little bit shakier, accounting and books and records, and have had to have a little bit worse process and controls. And so from a private equity buyer, as you're trying to understand what is this company that I'm looking at, and you want to gather as many reference data points as you can, this is another one on how buttoned up or not, is this company, that I'm trying to get to know. And I think the practical guidance would just be, at least know how to do this as a firm and do it once, so you know what it feels like. Because if you haven't done it before, the language sounds weird and the whole thing sounds foreign. It's easy to find someone, a legal counsel or a technology provider or somebody else, just so that to the extent that you're like, boy, I know that this might be an issue for my buyer, at least it's something you can do as a service for your client. You may decide not to use it everywhere. It is not the most important issue in almost all software deals, but I think it should be on the page.
And I had the same reaction to the scary stories. We're certainly not trying to scare people off. Your companies you're working with should be using open source. It's manageable. It just needs to be managed.
Absolutely. I think that our discussions were that it has an impact on M&A, has an impact on valuation. Phil and Lou in particular, you talked about, I think the quote is, smart buyers and sellers are asking a lot of questions and should be. Can you talk a little bit further about valuation impact and?
Well, take that.
Well, we don't typically get involved in the negotiation after we identify what the risks are, but we certainly talk to our customers about it. And I think we find it rarely tanks a deal. It's often correlated with a bunch of other problems if the deal does go south. That there's sometimes an impact on valuation, often an impact on terms and holdbacks. and that, that from the sell side, a company going in, knowing what they're dealing with, having disclosed what they're using, shown that they have consciousness of the issue, and that they've been doing something to manage it, don't run into those kind of problems nearly as much when they get to the transaction. So buyers ought to be concerned, and so sellers should be concerned because buyers are, and if they're proactive, they can manage the problems.
Excellent. One, I want to give the panel a chance to give any final thoughts and comments, but also ask if there are any questions from our audience. I guess we were that clear that there are none.
Got one,
So it's
one in the back
well
to the
done.
left.
Oh, yeah, one, okay, yes. Awesome.
Tony, probably your
Yeah,
department.
it's sort of
Might repeat it.
yeah, it can be yeah. So he's asking sort of what's the remediation typically? Is it replacing the components? So there's code remediation, which is replacing it, rewriting it, or removing it that we have. But there's also often sort of legal remediation. So sometimes you can contact the person who wrote the code and just ask them, can we have this under a different license? And it's that simple to deal with it. Sometimes we can negotiate a new agreement, or sometimes there was a past thing you've done wrong. It's tricky with open source is you might be shipping under the incorrect license, and there's 1,000 people who wrote this software, so you can't really go to them and get a waiver or something. But sometimes you can get some statements from the project and sort of resolve it that way. And another way some of our clients sort of resolve the risk of the open source is really through the contract terms in their transactions. So if you're on the buy side and you're subjecting the target to a code scan, you might just use your reps and warranties. You might add a specific indemnity to the agreement and up the escrow so that money's sitting there. So you kind of have an 18 or 24 months insurance policy that the company that you just bought is going to sort of take care of this, and those risks are going to go away. So there's sort of that way to address this too.
There's also Fender Stratocaster remediation.
Yeah.
This was a story I shared with a couple of folks today. I know an attorney who had the developer come to him and say, I found this code and there's this license that says we can use it if we buy the developer a Fender Stratocaster. I guess I better pull it out of the code. And he said, well, how hard is it to pull out? And he goes, it's a real pain. He said, well, how much does a Fender Stratocaster cost? So they actually bought a guitar, shipped it to the guy, FedEx, got the receipt, it went in the legal file, and it was remediated.
Excellent. So I'm told our time is up, but I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to us. I hope this was an interesting topic. There will be more to come. This will certainly be explored further as part of the collaboration between Merrill and M&A Advisor as part of our best practices, the best deal makers. I want to thank our panel for sharing their knowledge and time with us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.